Hi, so I've been asked a number of times actually to talk about the difference between capacitors, supercapacitors and batteries. And so I'm going to do that in this video. And if that isn't your thing, then probably the best thing to do is not watch the video. If it is what you're interested in, then I'm going to go into it a little bit. The problem with it though is that the answer you're looking for probably isn't the answer I'm going to give, and that's a shame. Because the answer a lot of people expect is that a capacitor is this, a supercapacitor is this, and a battery is this. Done. And that would be lovely if that's the way the world was. But of course it isn't the way the world was. That little box that we call capacitor, supercapacitor and battery are in fact categories to put things in to aid our understanding. Now it's important to categorise, because categorisation is the method by which we understand the world and create a map of it and then move through that world in a predictive kind of way. So categorisation is really important. But what tends to happen then is we fix those categories as being immutable. And of course they're not. It's the chair-table problem. We all understand what the category chair is. I mean, I'm sitting in a chair right now. And here it is, got a back, and I know it's a chair and I know how to use it. But there is a degree of chairness about that chair that makes it a chair. And if I change that degree, we get to a grey edge where the chair is difficult to recognise as a chair, where maybe we remove the back and we'd start calling it a stool. What about if I put my coffee cup on it? Is it a stool or a table? At what point does it transition between stool and table and become a whole new category? Now, to talk about it like that seems a little trivial, and I agree it is. But it also illustrates the point that I'm trying to make, that categories are fine to aid of understanding, but become an error when you think that that's all there are. Now there's lots of ways of understanding what a capacitor, supercapacitor or battery is, and there's lots of ways of defining them so that we can talk about them and understand which box they fit in. Now one way is, by definition, we can say that a capacitor is such a beast, and if it were not that beast, it would not be a capacitor. That's one way of doing it. And one way is to look at the function that it performs. If a capacitor in a circuit is acting as a smoothing filter, it's a capacitor. If it's in an energy storage and it's power dense, it's a capacitor. So we can define it by its function. We can talk about it by its structure, where we have two plates and a field in between them. There are lots of ways of actually looking at that to enable the understanding. The worst way, in my mind anyway, is to define it and say strictly that's what it is and it can't be that if it's not that thing. That, I think, is an extraordinarily narrow view, and rather than helping you understand, actually it just fixes your view and prevents understanding. So I tend to shy away very much from definition. I tend to be a functionalist, I tend to be a structuralist. I certainly don't define things that strictly and then stay with that definition. Now obviously we're on a curve of people, so it doesn't really matter what you say, somebody somewhere is going to disagree with you. And some people disagree rather loudly because they think that the louder they shout, the more truth they must be shouting. Well, it's not me, and I don't have much time for it, and if that's what you think, I don't really worry about it anyway, because that's you and not me. But if that's what you think, you're probably not going to like what it is that I'm saying, and that's okay. Thumbs me down. If we think about the structure of something, and that's what we'll talk about to a degree, then we can think of a capacitor as being the electrostatic equivalent of a magnet. If we get two magnets and we have them facing north and south, they'll pull towards each other because there's a field in between them. Swap them around, they'll push away because they have the same like field. And when we look at those magnets and feel that force, there's nothing between them, which is part of what makes it magical. Now we can see that if we sprinkle some iron filings there, then the iron will rotate to line up with the field, giving us a second-hand view of what that mystical force is. Now capacitors are very much the same, it's an electrical phenomenon as opposed to a magnetic phenomenon. When we get two plates and we put a charge on it, we actually create a field that induces the opposite charge on the plate. So we get two plates of metal and they'll have an opposite charge, and in between them is a field. Now, that field will have an effect on any material that's in between them. What they'll do is cause the molecules to line up, and when the field is turned off, those molecules will unline, releasing energy, and that's what the dielectric constant is. You can think of it a bit like a water pipe with a balloon in it. If we have a pipe and put a balloon and pour some water in, the balloon will pop out and it bulge out into the other side of the pipe, storing the energy. We then stop putting water in and let it come back out again. The balloon will tighten up and the water will be forced out. Of course, the strength at which that water is forced out will depend on what that balloon is made of, and it's very similar with capacitors. They have our materials have a property called the dielectric constant, which, if you like, in the same way is like the strength of the balloon. It has a strength of its ability to deal with that field and store the energy that that field is creating. Now, on something like polyethylene, that field is around about 4. It's just to give you an illustration of the differences between these things. If you use something like titanium dioxide, that's about 250. If you use something like barium titanate, that's something like 150,000. Now, the strength of a capacitor is related to the plate surface area, the distance they are apart, and that material in between, which is called the dielectric constant. We multiply those all together and we'll get a value for the capacitor. So clearly that material can have a big impact on the capacitor, and that makes sense when you think about the balloon that we just talked about. If that balloon is made of a pretty tough stuff, it takes a bit of force to get in there, when it springs back it's going to shoot a lot back out again. So it's obvious that those kind of materials would have a big difference in the energy that's stored in a device like that. That conception of parallel plates was essential and fundamental to understanding what a capacitor at that end was. Now, that was great for a very long time until we came up with supercapacitors, which are a real problem, of course, because they store an awful lot more energy than they should. The reason they do that is they have an enormous surface area. Now, you can do that with ordinary capacitors. If we take just a standard capacitor, which is a bit of metal on something like tantalum oxide or something like that, it'll have a capacitance. The nearer we can get those plates to each other, the higher the capacitance is going to go, because it's divided by the distance. The lower the distance, the higher the capacitance. When we look at an electrolytic capacitor, the electrolytic capacitor is basically an aluminium sheet, and then the dielectric is a bit of aluminium oxide. The other plate is in fact the electrolyte. It's just collected by yet another aluminium plate, but the plate is the electrolyte. That thickness of the aluminium oxide that grows or shrinks as you apply a current is the dielectric that is reducing or increasing the distance between the two plates, that is one piece of aluminium and the electrolyte. And so that distance can get very small indeed. And so electrolytic capacitors can store an awful lot of energy, far more than a solid-state capacitor. They are polarized, of course, because we need to maintain the aluminium oxide layer. But that movement from a strict material in terms of the two layers of plates to now a sudden electrolytic material is beginning that changeover from what a capacitor was. So if we define a capacitor as being two plates with something in between them, then the electrolytic capacitor actually stretches that a little bit. The plate has to be considered to be the electrolyte, so we're stretching that definition a little bit. When we move to something like the supercapacitor, then the large surface area afforded by the carbon's a very common thing for it. You can use other materials, but carbon's very common, creates an adsorbed layer of ions on the surface of the carbon. Let's say, for instance, it has a negative charge and we get a layer of positive charges on it. Obviously, we now have a positive layer, and that will attract a layer of negative charges. So we get two charges now, two layers of charged ions with a separation between them. And we have what looks like a traditional capacitor, that is, two plates charged between them, field in between. That double layer, incidentally, is called the Helmholtz layer, and it will continue to grow, plus minus, plus minus, plus minus, until the dynamics of the system overwhelm the ability for those layers to grow. The length of those layers is actually called the Debye length, so they will continue to grow. Here you should be able to see that definition is being stretched yet again, because now instead of just having two passive components, that is two plates, in relationship to each other, we actually have a very strongly active component now. Now that system actually consists of moving ions laying up in layers. Of course, if we do that, we can also start to introduce other effects. So the surface of the carbon, for instance, will have an impact on the ability of that surface to attract the positive ions. So changing that surface will change the number of ions that are attracted to it, and therefore the energy that's going to be stored in that device. But have we strictly just done that by applying a charge to one surface and creating a field, or have we introduced an element of electrochemistry in there? Well, of course we've introduced an element of electrochemistry. Once you introduce an element of electrochemistry, you then begin to move towards batteries, because batteries are electrochemical systems. Traditionally, of course, they were just redox systems, reduction oxidation, but they were electrochemical systems. And here we have a device that is kind of half a battery and half a capacitor, because we've got that layer that we were looking at when we looked at the original capacitor, but now we've got an electrochemical element to it. And yet there is no actual reaction, there's just an electrochemical contribution, there's no real reaction going on there. So it's not a battery. But equally, there is an electrochemical element to it, so it's not a capacitor. So we started defining this mid-stage point where it stores a lot of energy, my mistake. It stores a lot of power, but not a lot of energy. So we have this device in the middle, which is very power dense, and we started to call those supercapacitors. And one of the things that helps differentiate a supercapacitor from a battery is the power density. Supercapacitors aren't very energy dense, they can't store a lot of energy, but they're extremely power dense, which means that because they are separated only by the interatomic distance of the plus and the minus ion, that field will collapse very rapidly, and it can deliver the energy very rapidly indeed, and power is energy over time. So we started to create these devices. But of course people just can't resist on fiddling on with things. When you fiddle on with things and start doing other stuff to it, again you start to change it. So looking at the original surface of carbon, then modifying it so it did that job better, and creating points of active site and introducing an electrochemical element was only one aspect of what we actually started to do. We also started to look at the electrolyte. Could the electrolyte be enabled to store more energy? And of course it can, because we're looking at electron transfer. So if we actually adsorb an ion and change the electrons in that ion, then there is a Faraday reaction going on. Now, it may be very short term, it may be a very short distance, and it may not last a long time, but there is an element, a strong element of Faraday reaction. And that, because it's such transient reaction, is called a pseudo-Faraday reaction. As Faraday reactions occur at the surface, through the ion on the electrolyte which you can select. And so, are we actually introducing redox behaviour? Well, yes we are, and it's like it's pushing it towards the battery end of things, and this begins to get us a bit more confused, because now we're moving this capacitive device along that scale towards a battery-like device, and it becomes questionable about whether that chair is a table or not. The other side of things, of course, is that batteries for a very long time were only one thing, which is great, because it was easy to understand them. They were a tub with two bulk elements in there. We had an electrochemical reaction, a redox reaction, and we got energy out. Awesome, that's a battery. But because we then came up with other mechanisms for storing energy. So when you think about a traditional battery of that type, you're thinking of lead-acid batteries. When you think of a lithium-ion battery, actually that's not what's going on. What goes on in a lithium-ion battery is that the ions are shuttled between the cathode and the anode that have different energy states depending on where those ions sit. If you think about what it is, then you tend to have a graphite layer and then another layer of material on the other side. It's usually something like lithium phosphate or something like that. The electrolyte tends to be lithium tetrafluoroborate, for example. And so the lithium ion can shuttle across between those two materials and be hosted by those materials and sit in the galleries of the graphite. Then you start to ask yourself, actually, if that battery is doing that, and we've just talked about supercapacitors having pseudo-Faradaic reaction sites on their surfaces, and here we have a battery with a Faradaic reaction site on its surface, where's the difference, damn it? And it does become a very grey area. and where that difference actually exists. So it becomes difficult really to start to separate these things out when you start to look at the transitions from one point to the other point. Now we talked a little bit there about how that energy is stored. So in a battery like the lithium-ion battery, it's often referred to as a rocking chair battery because the ion just rocks between the two. It's just a mechanism for storage of energy. I tend to think about these things in terms of the storage of energy, but that's because that's my particular interest. That's what I want to do. I'm very interested in how much energy it can store and how quickly it can deliver that energy, that is, how much power it's got. So I tend to see all of these devices as energy storage devices along a schema, as opposed to being a specific thing that does only a certain job. But that's my own limitation. That's because I'm only interested in that one job. So frequency dependency, for instance, is of no interest to me at all. As long as the thing can cycle, I don't care if the supply is a couple of gigahertz. But then I don't design circuits for mobile phones, so frequency dependency is just not an issue for me. There are plenty of people who do, in which case they would hate the way I see this, because to them a capacitor is a specific thing doing a specific job, and that's good, because to me it's just the same. It's just a job that I'm interested in is energy storage. So I don't really differentiate much between those things, only in terms of their ability to store and release that energy under certain conditions. So for me, a battery is something that will store an awful lot of energy and release it slowly. A supercapacitor is something that won't store that much energy but will release it very quickly. A capacitor obviously stores next to none, but the ability to get that energy out is almost instantaneous. So I'm only interested in that aspect of it, and as I said, that's my limitation for those things. In general terms, of course, the function a capacitor needs to perform within a circuit is part of how you want to understand that capacitor. Now, I don't particularly want to understand it in electronic terms, so I don't know that much about it, if I'm brutally honest. I want to understand it in terms of storage and its chemistry, as I'm a chemist, and that's what I know about and what is actually I've focused on. So if you have a different functional view and you want to challenge what it is that I'm saying, that's fine. It just means that your function that you want to perform is different from the function that I want to perform. Forgive me. So thinking about the difference between capacitors, supercapacitors and batteries, we've introduced quite a lot of ideas. One thing is you need to think about the function and define what it is that you're asking in terms of that. So why are you asking that question? What job do you want to do? And if you're like me and you want the job to be energy storage, then you're going to be driven down one route of understanding the difference between these things. If you have a different function in mind, you're going to want to have another understanding of the function of these things. So the function you want, the job you want it to do should impact heavily on your understanding of the differences between them. The structures that we've talked about also should heavily impact how it is you think about it, whether it's something to do with the parallel plate formation or it's something to do with a chemical reaction. Those are going to help define what makes a device a particular device. So, as I say, I don't think it was a particularly clear-cut answer, because I don't think there is a particularly clear-cut answer, but I do hope it helped to some degree in understanding where it is or where these things sit on that schema. But where they sit on that schema has a great deal, unfortunately, to do with you and what it is you want to understand about them. And that's obviously something that frequently escapes people, because like I say, a lot of people want the answer, it's this, it's this, it's this. That's the truth, deal with it. Unfortunately, of course, that isn't the way things are, at least it's not the way I see things. I see things as being driven by what you want to do with it and what understanding you need to have of it in order to be able to define it and use it and develop it. It's not very satisfying, but it's the best answer I can give. So I hope it was of interest, I hope it did help and didn't just confuse, and thank you very much for watching.